Hi everyone, this is Blake Anderson, and I'm going live now here on my therapy channel. And today I just want to talk about aspects of, the 5 stages of being a scapegoat and how to consider these different stages and how it might help you on your journey in terms of, just the different ways in which this usually operates within a family system. So I'm just going to start off by introducing myself, and then I'll share these 5 stages. And then, if there's others that join, I'll just maybe if there's some questions, I can answer them in the chat. So my name is Blake Anderson, and I'm a registered social worker, and I am a therapist here in Toronto, Ontario. And have over 14 years collective experience as a social worker, and 5 years as a therapist. And so I've been in the last about 4 or 5 years now specializing primarily in those who have been on the receiving end of narcissistic abuse, as well as scapegoat recovery. And I mostly focus on within the family system. So if this is narcissistic parents or could be a sibling. But I've also worked with couples as well, and then also with individuals who are on the receiving end of narcissistic abuse. Occasionally in the past, I've also worked with people that are considered to be, I guess, narcissistic, and maybe it's their partner that's motivating the therapy and want me to speak to their partner. And that's mostly to do with just helping with some of the behaviors. And that's something maybe to discuss too. I'll talk about is just the notion between narcissistic, like a whole full NPD, but then having narcissistic style, or there's also narcissistic types. So this is just to understand that to some degree it exists on spectrum. And but typically I'm working on with the receiving end, like those who would be considered, the loved ones usually, or a romantic partner that could be considered maybe codependent, or at least has aspects of in being in this dynamic. And some of my experiences, I've worked 8 years in child welfare, so I definitely got to see a lot of different family dynamics. And I was involved in the court system at times, and have to to do assessments in homes and that kind of thing. So I definitely am kind of been aware of this dynamic for many years. And what else to say? Yeah, so it's mostly just people who have been like in the scapegoating role, or come from a family of origin that's people that my parents would be considered narcissistic. And so in today's video, I just wanted to talk about the map and the territory of the scapegoat. So considering it from like 4 levels. And the first level is to understand that, well, I guess I also want to first talk about the theory of change model. So that's usually applied to people who are considered to be like an addiction. And so, the typical framework for that is denial, contemplation, and then you go to action, and then you go to maintenance. And so I think that can be applied here to this situation with the scapegoat. And Robert Keegan is also a person I'll mention. And he just has this, he's a psychologist, and he has a book called In Over Our Head. And that's, I would say, a really good book in terms of, he just has many things about his theory, but he has like a stage model, and he has this notion of the subject and object. So I'll be speaking about that, just in terms of the scapegoating, first being part of your subject or the family of origin. Obviously as we age, we get, we're a child, the family is very much a subject of ourselves. Like we act from like it's part of us, right? And then as we age, we individuate and we mature, and then we start to, become more independent. But then we're hopefully in that process able to make the family more of an object in our awareness versus acting it from our subject, if that makes sense. So we're less emotionally fused with the family. And the family's always in us. And if it's a dysfunctional family, obviously some of those patterns, or our behavior in maybe our romantic relationships or in our friendships or our work environment, we could be acting out some negative patterns, maybe due to like narcissistic parent, or with just some level of dysfunction in the family. And I'll also speak about like differentiation and bone family therapy. So that's a modality I use. So in terms of the first stage, naivety and embeddedness. So if we want to again take that change model, this would be that we're in a pre-contemplative stage. So in some sense, we're in denial, but obviously it's because we're a child, right? And the thing is, from a young age, we probably still maybe pick up on these things, but then we repress them, and maybe we have an argument with our father or our mother, and we know perhaps they're not acting right, but we stand up for ourselves. But then there may be this argument, but then we suppress maybe the excesses of that, or we want to see the good in our, I think, family and our parents. But it's also just normalized too, right? It's the air we breathe, right? It's our family, and it's the notion is that the family is like our first constellation, or our universe, basically. And especially with our relationship with our mother, we're the first 1 to 2 years, right, very much fused with the mother, and or with like a primary caregiver. And so that's just also where aspects where we can understand narcissism too. But I guess in this, yeah, it's just you're a child, you're in over your head in some sense. It's your family. The abuse and neglect are like the air you breathe. So again, to take Robert Keegan's concept, you're subject to the trauma, so it's in your subject. You cannot see the dysfunction because you are in the dysfunction in the family's eyes as well. So typically, the scapegoat from a very young age gets chosen, and maybe there's probably some research around, like, is it due to temperament, but for whatever reason, right, this child gets scapegoated typically from a young age. And with scapegoating, again, I've explained it in other videos, but it's it's with, if you have narcissistic parent or a narcissist, like both parents, then obviously because they can't own their own like psychological material, like their shame, they're they have a lot of like a shadow element, and they don't want to face, and so they need to project that onto the child. And a lot of this is probably done unconsciously. And you could also understand it from like a family lineage, is that some people talk about genetics, obviously, with DNA getting passed down, but it's getting this intergenerational transmission process. If you take bone family therapy, there's the identified patient, and then there's just the notion of the family as an emotional unit. And so there needs to be, these triangles usually occur, and so the anxiety needs to be offloaded somewhere. And I think in less dysfunctional homes, that's occurring because sometimes the kids will have certain behaviors, maybe because the parents are stressed and they have their own, background. And so there's ways in which this operates, but especially if the parents are really dysfunctional, and there's no notion, right, of crazy and extra crazy. So if you have a parent that's extra crazy, the family emotional unit does their best, I think, to try to, there's emotional fusion, and there's the notion of the collective ego mass, or the collective undifferentiated collective ego mass. So it's just the notion that the narcissistic parent or parents fuse with the kids, and that there's not really a lot of boundaries in these families, and it's not usually, there's no feedback loop. And so anyway, so the scapegoat gets selected as like the identified patient, as the carrier of the shadow, and but that's part of their subject from a very young age. And maybe they get, perhaps they have some insecurities growing up, they get blamed for things, or there's situations like maybe they're being bullied at school and they're getting picked on, and then at home, because basically a narcissist is, like, in some sense, a bully, right? So you might pick that up from being picked on from your parents, or your brother maybe, or like a sister. And then in school system, perhaps you're repeating that because that's what you're used to, or what in some sense unconsciously you're comfortable with. And then this gets just passed down. So also the notions, the family dynamic, it's often covert. So I'm speaking more about parents and families that are more covert, because maybe it's like on the surface everything looks great in your family. Maybe you guys, like, you have you have your resources met, maybe like you're middle class or upper middle class, or you have just a home that at least from the outside people would say, oh, that's a nice family. And but because the parents, maybe they have good jobs, they maintain jobs, but there's never a way in which, there usually sometimes there's people that will like maybe it's a teacher, or sometimes they can come into contact with society and there is some feedback. And so I guess reality does, maybe from a young age, you can, pay attention to maybe some of these times where, either family, friends, or teachers. But usually when you're younger, obviously you're not picking up on that, but you probably suppress it, but it's also, you're just, you're a child, right? So you just don't have the abilities to have that rational, like, self-reflection. But maybe as an adult, you look back and you kind of see these connections, if that makes sense. But you're the one that has this neurosis probably, and so you can have anxiety, body issues, maybe behavioral outbursts, but the family points to you as the problem. And that's just, again, to go back to Bowen family therapy, is he was working with schizophrenic patients, and then what he did is he just looked at the family too, and he just saw that there's ways to understand mental health, I think, for the notion of the child. And I would see this also in child welfare, where you would have sometimes parents, and they're probably stressed, and they have one child that has behavioral issues, and maybe this is behavior issues that are acting out, in the home, but also in the school system. But then they would basically want us to fix their child. And but often I would see certain patterns. I would just pay attention to the family. Dad's stressed, mom's maybe got depression, and then the child's acting out. And so you obviously understand that there's stressors in the system. And it's not just, sometimes there is children, like if they have autism, or that there's certain mental health that the child has, or certain disposition, like opposition to defiant disorder or ADHD. Anyway, there's ways in which it could be the child to some degree, and they have temperaments. But then at the same time, you also understand it's from a family system. And so I guess I just wanted to mention that this is the first stage. And perhaps you have memories of this, but you probably suppressed a lot of this, maybe. You accepted the narrative as perhaps being difficult or too sensitive. So you likely internalize a lot of this, right, in this first stage, but you might still have conflict maybe with a parent that's narcissistic. And now the first stage is you're innocent here. You're observing the projective identification of the parents, and you're holding their shadow. So these are all elements in which you are in the first stage, right? But it's part to take Keegan. It's part of your subject, and so you're not able to see it as an object in your awareness, if that makes sense. But then in your school or with your friends, perhaps there's some behaviors or some insecurities that are coming out. And so the second stage is, I would consider, like, there's a notion of a geographic cure and the awareness gap. So to take the change model, the theory of change model, this could be considered the contemplative stage. So you have some awareness of this dynamic, but you probably still blame yourself, and you still probably working on yourself, and maybe you're going to like a therapist and like a psychologist or a psychotherapist, and perhaps there's like anxiety, or maybe you're having relationship difficulties, but usually there's the notion of the repetition compulsion. So that's to take Freud, is just to understand that you perhaps unconsciously, right, you're repeating similar patterns from your family of origin, but then you might obviously not be aware that a lot of this started maybe with your family of origin because you've suppressed it, or was part of your subject. But then you're in therapy, or you're just, you're dealing with these challenges in your life, and you're starting to ask yourself, like, why does this keep happening? Or why do people treat me this way? Or why do I tolerate this? And so these are just understandings that you're having some contemplation of it, having issues in yourself, but maybe making some connections to the parents or the family, but maybe it's a professional or like a therapist that's pointing it out, like when you start talking about your family. But like some of my clients, right, well, I'll speak to them, and they'll say, my childhood was great. It was a great childhood. My parents were awesome. And obviously that could be the case. But sometimes if you dig a little bit deeper and you start talking to them for a few sessions, you do obviously pay attention that, they do pick up on things that maybe they suppressed. So it's also to understand, like, our memory isn't always obviously 100%. Like, we do shape it to some degree, or it's not always like we're seeing it like eye for eye, like for what it is, right? Or like what exactly happened. So the notion of the geographic cure, so that's just like some people say that they moved away. So there's the separation. So for a lot of kids and teenagers, this happens around, 18 or maybe 20. Like some, kids are staying in their family longer. And sometimes there's cultural components where you stay with your family until you get married or so. But a lot of the times, subconsciously, maybe even you really, well, some of your times it's conscious, like you actually knew that at 18, I need to get out of my house and I need to leave my family. But often it's maybe just the case it's subconscious, like it's like, okay, I you just want to get away in some sense from your family. And then maybe let's say you move up to university or you just move to a different city, but there's a notion of the geographic cure. So you separate yourself from the family and maybe it's subconscious, maybe it's not, but you're doing that in some sense, maybe because your body or just like something in you and your conscience knows that this isn't right, and maybe there's a lot of drama and chaos that's going on in your home. And again, you probably have some awareness that it's your family, but you still, what to see, you see them and probably in a good light still. And what to say? So yeah, you move to university, this notion of geographic here, trying to fix an internal problem by changing external location. And in bone family therapy, this, you might, he would get you to trace like, well, what to say, there could be the notion of emotional cutoff. So it's like you cut off yourself from the emotions of the family dynamic. But then you're probably, let's say you still can visit the family and you go home for, I don't know, it's like Christmas or like Thanksgiving or for these special occasions, you might still see your family. And within that, there's perhaps the narcissistic abuse cycle but it's likely the case that you blame yourself within that cycle because if there's the idealization phase, first there's notion like you're away, let's say, and there's the hoovering. So maybe you've had some conflict with your parents, but then there's a hoovering and there's love bombing and they idolize you. And so you might forget or say, oh, well, they're acting a lot better now. It's like maybe, and then maybe you also blame yourself. It's like, okay, I'm going to go home. I'm going to try not to argue. If my brother, picks on me or says something, I'll just let it go or something like this. But there's this probably narrative that you've internalized that you're too much or that you're the one that seemingly is the problem. And so there's probably a lot of internalized blame and I guess toxic shame that you have. And so you go home and then you're with your family and maybe a few days go well. And obviously every family is different, right? So it's kind of challenging to paint exactly, but this is sort of like the template, right? Is, you may go home for a few days and there's the idolization phase, things are fine. But then there is an argument or there's some outburst. And this is probably the case that the parent that's narcissistic, they might bait you in some sort, or it could be a sibling. And as I'm sure a lot of people know within this dynamic is that because the parents are splitting, because the psyche of the narcissist, someone's really a narcissist, they split the kids and then they pit them against each other. So there's always this competition. But you might grow up and think, okay, well, this is just my siblings, we don't get along, or my brother or my sister, it's just this way. And you understand maybe this is competition, but you think maybe that's normal for like just what other kids do or what other siblings do. But then anyway, so there's a splitting that's occurring. And so it could be some kind of outburst from the siblings, or it could be the parents, or the parents are going along with the siblings. And there's many different dynamics, but let's just say that there's a devaluation phase. And for whatever reason, you get blamed for this outburst or this, it could be the notion of narcissistic injury or narcissistic rage. So your parent really seems to get very angry at you, like quite strongly. And you're like, okay, well, I know I messed up here, but why is such a big deal? And why is this big drama around it? And maybe at first, it's wrong. And so you stand up for yourself. But then just the weight of the family and just the way that the next day, let's say, there's like gaslighting, right? Because the narcissist doesn't admit their wrongdoing usually. Or the siblings maybe will speak to the surface level of what happened. Or they might not have been there, but let's just say that they were there. They might acknowledge, okay, yeah, that dad does that sometimes. But then it's likely the case that they normalize it and they also maybe blame you to some degree. If you kind of, you're obviously probably distraught and upset. And so maybe you get anxious and you're starting to like get emotionally dysregulated because obviously it's your parent. And obviously when you've been on the receiving end of narcissistic rage, it's like, it's a very would say, it probably trembles you, and it creates a certain shock to the system, obviously, right? And so you're in that probably state. And anyway, but it gets to the point where you get roped back in maybe because you're like, okay, I tried to talk to my family, it doesn't work. And maybe you also blame yourself. It's like, I knew this was going to happen. Why does there always have to be this drama with my family? But anyway, that's just an example of the second stage is where you're starting to probably become aware of this dynamic, and but you're probably still focused on it being your problem and your neurosis. And you try your best to navigate this, and you think maybe the next time I need to communicate better, or if I just act a certain way, this won't happen next time. And again, maybe you see somewhat your parents being a problem, but you probably will also put the label of them being like a full-blown narcissist, or like a narcissistic family, or like full dysfunction. You would maybe just normalize it more, because again, you're probably still used to that in just the way you are. So yeah, I think I've explained the abuse cycle. You enter the loop of idolization, love bombing, then there's a devaluation, usually it's criticism, and then you're discarded. And then obviously with the discard too, it's like there can be silent treatment. So you can go many months or just a few days, and it's like there's this notion of intermittent reinforcement, right? So a parent will just they might completely withhold affection or any kind of, and that silence is right. It's like as a child, there's like probably that child part of you that's like, okay, why is my mom not reaching out to me now? We had this incident when I was home, but now she's not reaching out. And so it probably plays off of your attachment needs, right? Or your insecurities. And so in that process, maybe you gaslight yourself, like, well, maybe I was wrong to say that, and my parents are blaming me and my siblings are blaming me. That's like, I must be the problem, because like it just makes sense, right? And but you kind of like that cognitive dissonance is like intellectually you knew it was wrong, but then over time your emotions and just your psyche, right? It's the family, and you just, I guess, to play nice, you get back into the cycle, and maybe you just get on with your life and you kind of suppress it, and it's just like you kind of forget it in some sense. But yeah, that's just you internalize it still. You notice the issue, but you're still internalizing the blame. If I just communicate better, they will understand. There's also the enablers you might try to talk to, like this, like again, the siblings, or I guess considered the flying monkeys, or but they deny your reality and protect the status quo. So yeah, your reality testing is this because of the distortion of the family. You still believe the distortions. And so the third phase, and I'm going to talk about just the notion that in the third stage, it's the repetition compulsion and the crisis. So this is the preparation stage. And so in the wider world, you start seeing these patterns in your romantic relationships or your workplace. So this is, again, to go back to Freud's repetition compulsion. You subconsciously seek out familiar dynamics, emotionally unavailable partners maybe, to try to fix the original trauma. And then within this too is that you probably just understand like other families, and you see just how other families act. You're probably like, let's say in your 20s maybe, perhaps like you've just had a little more experience. And so I'm just going to take a sip of my coffee here. Yeah, you're just seeing more like other families and how they operate. And let's just say that you're, this geographic separation, and it could be even be in the same city, but you've obviously separated from your parents to some degree, or from your family of origin. And then you're going, maybe there's like bits of connection. So you just realize, I guess, over time that why is it that my parents aren't responding the way that my other friends are, or I seem to reach out to them and they're like, there's this pseudo mutuality. It's like, it always seems to be you, the one that's giving to the family, or the one that has to initiate. And that goes back to the silent treatment and I guess the power games that the family can play. And if you're the scapegoat, and this notion of the parents being, if they're truly narcissistic, right, they internalize the kids and you're just an extension of them. And so in some sense, they don't treat you as an independent, autonomous, I would say, object or person with their own selfhood, right? And because they have this internalized snapshot, and maybe that's from a younger age. And according to like Sam Vakin, it's a negative. Well, it's not. It's a snapshot, and it's like devoid of empathy. So, and they don't really update the snapshot over time. Really, like they might pick up on things that you do differently, but anyway, it's just the notion that they need you to get in line with this internalized image of that they have, and they have a certain agenda. And so you always are playing, I guess, to their needs, right? And versus you're growing and becoming an adult. And again, anyway, there's many ways this shows up. You could also sometimes people are like more fused with their family and they start a romantic relationship and they're getting married, and maybe then one at the wedding that like something happens where their mom, like maybe the mother-in-law is like kind of becomes, there's a lack of differentiation, and they just do something to kind of mess up the marriage or like the wedding. And so there's just usually like an incident. And so, and perhaps it's like the other partner pointing out that to the, let's say it's the husband, and just saying like, your mom is overbearing and she's overstepping, and why aren't you standing up for me, sort of thing. And so sometimes it's, someone outside of like a more healthier person, pointing it out to you. And then I've had that with kind of a few men, right, where it's just like their partners maybe in some sense feeling like they're being thrown under the bus, sort of thing. And then the husband obviously understands that their mom's a certain way, but then, because it's again part of their subject growing up, then they haven't really fully grasped, I guess, this like patterns, or they tend to, I guess, minimize it. And but then perhaps this partner is getting scapegoated in some sense. So that's like, there's different ways this shows up, but I think there starts to be more of awareness, and that's the sort of third stage. So it could be you're in a crisis, like a breakup, a job loss, and you turn to your family for support, but then they don't like respond in an appropriate way or the way that you would think they would. And there's probably many of these examples throughout your childhood if you come from a narcissistic family, is like times you had like these bids for connection, but then it was very inappropriate, their reaction. And also they probably, because if it's the notion, right, if the adult children of emotionally mature parents, if they're emotionally mature, I mean, there's a level of difference between emotional maturity and narcissism, but emotionally mature person, obviously they keep it usually very surface level. And so if they lack empathy, and even like you have a strong emotion, like, if you lost your job, let's say, and you go to your mom and you say like, look, I lost my job. And she might just be like, well, it happens. And like, she might start talking about herself, or she might say something inappropriate, like, well, you shouldn't have, like, so she kind of puts you down, where, a person that has empathy and like would care about you obviously would try to be there for you. Right. And, so anyway, that's just understand there can be a crisis, and then you really understand like, why is my family so different, or why are they like this? And it also could be just one parent you pick up on, or like a sibling. So it's not always the case that you see the family as a system as the problem per se, but you start to notice this pattern. So again, instead of empathy, you get mockery. So it's tough love or indifference. So, and you might even associate this tough love that's like, okay, yeah, I do have to like stand up for myself, and I need to like not allow this to affect me. But like, obviously, if like you lose your job or you have a breakup, that's like, it's normal to go through emotions, right? But then if you're from this family where it's like, it could be mockery or just tough love or indifference. Like they don't really have much of a reaction, because they're obviously, if you're narcissistic, you're more consumed probably with their own life. And again, if you're just an extension of them, your strong emotions are just sort of like an inconvenience probably. And because they just want to keep things superficial and surface level, they probably get uncomfortable with your strong reactions, and they maybe just, have a little empathy for them. They just maybe learn those skills, but in some sense, they also don't care. So they don't have the empathy, but obviously something's off and something's missing. But then you might explain that away still and sort of say, well, that's the way my mom is, and, or my dad is. But so you start to realize the realization. So you realize that their love is conditional. So you realize that's like the way that you act changes, and you have to kind of go along usually with their agenda. And so you're only valuable when you are serving their image or needs. And I think that's just a good point, is that you start to pick up But then maybe you see this repetition compulsion in your relationships where, you find similar patterns and you start to maybe make connections to your family, but you always thought it was like yourself, or you thought it was like something to do with your own neurosis. But then, in some sense, we obviously have our own mental health. So it's not to say like the family's always the cause of that, but at least we start to see some patterns from our family of origin that's we consider narcissistic or dysfunctional. So there's the pseudo mutuality. So you see the fake closeness of the family. You realize you are pitted against siblings in a competition. You can never win. So that's understand the third stage. And the phase 4. So this is taking action, and the narcissistic injury. So this is the action stage. And so it's like the case that maybe you went no contact or you went low contact. You stop playing the game and you set hard boundaries. The cognitive dissonance, this is the hardest part. Intellectually, they are toxic, but emotionally, you miss the good times or the fantasy of having a family. So that's just the challenge of the scapegoat, is that at the end of the day, you're just like, you're here on the planet or the universe. You came into this dynamic. At the end of the day, imagine you just wanted, obviously, a healthy, happy family. And obviously every family goes through challenges, but you thought that you were able to communicate, but then you start to realize that it doesn't have anything to do with you. And that's like an ongoing journey. I think we all struggle with that, I think. And because it's so strong, this, like when you have the whole family kind of against you, it's like, it is hard, the scapegoat, to stay strong. And usually the thing is like, you've probably maybe done this a few times. Like you might have went no contact for, let's say, 6 months to a year, but then, I don't know, holidays come around, or maybe your mom reaches out to you and like starts saying like nice things as she starts acting like the mother you used to like, at least like, and like she reminds you of some of the good times. And then there's a notion of like future faking, and the notion of like hoovering, right? And of love bombing. And what to say, you probably might even be aware of these stages at this point, because you're at the fourth stage. You're probably knowing that your mom's probably going to hoover you back in, and this could be love bombing, or it could be just her ways to get back into your life. But then it's like, at the end of the day, you also want to have at least some level of a relationship with your mom. And so it's like, I guess the question is like, how do you navigate that without her driving the ship always, or it's always her agenda? And that's tricky, right? Because if someone's narcissistic, they don't like to take any feedback. And so, what to say? So anyway, there's a notion, right, that you might re-engage contact and you try it again. Maybe you have this notion, right, at this point, probably of like gray rocking, and of, you just probably know that and also there's a notion of, right, of an adult self and a child self. And I think usually at this stage, I would say at the fourth stage, is that you start to grieve I think as all of us will become adults, right, we have to grieve the parent that we thought they were, right? Like, 'cause we tend to obviously idolize our parents from a young age. And then we realize at a certain point, like usually when our teenagers, right, we start to rebel more because we realize our parents aren't perfect and they're, just human beings. But then especially with a narcissistic parent, it's like, you really understand that they have probably this extreme deficit or like a personality disorder. And, so the adult self understands this and knows this probably just through reason. But then there's a child part of ourselves, right, that still, it's very much primordial to who we are, and very much at our base level, right, where we seek love and affection from our parents, right? And if we don't have, we maybe just don't want to be alone, or there's certain insecurities we probably have that we want to at least try. So in this stage where maybe we're still going back, but we're limiting contact for the most part, we're doing our best to individuate and differentiate ourselves and have our own thoughts and feelings. But within this, usually the parents know that we're pulling away and that we probably have some awareness of them. And it depends again on the narcissist. So like, everyone's different, but it's likely the case that they know that you're onto them, or at least like that the relationship's changed. And I think through the gray rock too, it's like, I think that can work, but it's like, if you are still interacting with them, again, every family's different. So maybe there's a way in which you can navigate this that you get less pulled in. And really the notion is to stay calm and to, stay centered in yourself during these interactions. I have one client where it's, she has a sister that she considers narcissistic, and she worries that, she just limits it to like, okay, I'm going to talk to my sister for an hour, and that's all I can do. And after an hour comes out, I'll leave. And or if she engages in certain conversations, I'll just deflect them. And so she's just kind of has a strategy around, interacting with her sister. But then, and anyway, her situation, her mom gets pulled in and enables it. So it's kind of challenging. But that's just to understand is like if you still want to have contact, you have low contact, maybe you're gray rocking, but then maybe let's say it's the mom knows that you're kind of the relationship's changed. And it's likely because the narcissist, right, feeds on narcissistic supply. And so they need you, and they also the notion of a shared fantasy. So they want to continue that shared fantasy. But if they're not getting that positive attention and they like you're gray rocking them, in sense, what gray rocking means, right, is just like you're staying very neutral, you're not giving them a lot of supply in some sense. You're not sharing necessarily a lot of information about your life per se, like you're just keeping it surface level. And all this to protect yourself and just be less emotionally reactive. But it's likely the case, depends on the narcissist, right? But maybe it's the siblings or the mom or the dad is going to find ways probably to create some instigation or to, and there could be the notion of the flying monkeys too within this dynamic, but they're probably going to try to get a rise out of you maybe, or just a reaction so that you get emotionally dysregulated. And if you're the scapegoat, then they can smear your name or discredit you and get a reaction and justify it to others or to like paint a certain picture that, see, he's the difficult one. And if they know in some levels probably that they're the instigator, of course, I guess they do know. And that's the thing, we can talk about like if they know or they don't know, or are they doing this intentionally, or like, are my parents evil? There's a lot of ways we can understand this, but obviously they're looking for an instigation. You kind of like, we're all human, right? So they probably find something in your cheeks and your armor that really gets to you. And let's say you have kids or something, or there's something that really means a lot to you, but they use that against you. Or and so you being human, you probably just react and there's no notion of fight, flight, fawn, and freeze, right? So we could be in this fight phase where we just defend ourselves, and then maybe because we've done some research, we kind of blame them and we tell that to them. So anyway, that's just to understand that we're still trying to maybe engage in the cycle. We've become aware of it. There are different families, and I think you can navigate this in a way that you're not as emotionally reactive. And I've seen some of my clients, right, where it's like they step more out of that role self where they used to when they were like a kid. I think they've grieved a lot of this, like in some sense, they've grieved their family. Like obviously they're still alive, but it's almost like they know that the way they are now. And it's also working on the inner child, because again, you subconsciously and emotionally still probably seek out, your mom to be there, your dad to be there. But I guess it's just the notion that you have to ultimately do that for yourself. And there's a notion of like inner bonding therapy, and you can do like visualizations about like, this inner child, and, no one probably was there for that child growing up maybe. And so you have to like basically comfort that child and like, just talk to yourself in a way that, again, you can go to therapy and that helps obviously, but that's more like analytical usually. And there's also the notion of somatic exercises, and usually in this stage too, is that your body, a lot of people talk about the body usually picks up this first, like you start to notice your body reacting with your family, and so you pay attention. So it's interesting that the body first usually knows, and then you're realizing like it's giving you signs, right? But maybe for so many years you ignored this intuition of yours, but that was because you kind of basically had to, right? That was just your family and what you thought was normal, right? So I'm just gonna so again, hoovering. So this is the sense that you're pulling away. They switch to nice mode. They might offer gifts, shallow apologies, or warmth. There's also intermittent reinforcement, like a slot machine. They are breadcrumbing you to get your back into the shared fantasy. The smear campaign. So If hoovering fails, they'll switch to victimization. And so this is like you kind of know that they're probably future faking, or you know that the way let's say your mom or your dad's going to act, and you kind of understand they're probably going to reach out at some point, and or they send a message. And so it's hard because like in the end of the day, you want to have that relationship with them, but ultimately it's always about them. And so I guess that's the question. So let's just say you go and you go no contact, and that doesn't work. So the hoovering phase doesn't work. Whereas in the past, maybe sort of many years, that hoovering stage did work in some sense. And yeah, but now if that doesn't work, they know that, okay, wow, he's actually gone this time. Then there's usually the smear campaign. So they again switch to the victimization. They maybe tell relatives that you're unstable or cruel. But ultimately, they need to be the victim to maintain their false self, right? Because, yeah, so they just spin a story that you're this way. And yeah, every family's different, but maybe like you go home and you start to pay attention to like certain family members. There's certain signs usually, right? They say things to you, or let's say you have relatives and they say like, oh, how are you doing? I heard some things about you. Everything okay? Like, so there's always a sense that maybe like, let's say aunts and uncles or family members, that people that you also probably respect too, and that you've looked up for many years and have had a relationship with maybe, they are like giving the sense that like something's off, or you just walk in a room, right? And you just notice like something's off, and like there seem to be, there's just seems to be questions about you. And so you start picking up on these signs. And again, some of this can be more overt, but sometimes it's a little bit more covert. But you just know that like with your other friends or people like, in your life don't see you this way. But then within this family dynamic, you have this reputation that you're like a difficult person, or because you're the scapegoat, and because you started to make boundaries and be healthier and more differentiate, now the family or the narcissistic parent has to smear your name, so that ultimately, because they need to protect their false self. And it's very cruel, right, that a parent would do this to their child. But I guess at the end of the day, it's like if you understand narcissism, it's just like that's just sort of the way they are. Not that excuses it, but it's just that's again grieving this parent's like adult self and this child self. And I think where people get stuck is sometimes when the child self's still needing that, and then they get angry because it's like, mom, like why can't you just be like show some care? And it's like you try to give them feedback, but it just doesn't go anywhere. It's like an empty void. But then they also probably spin those words and maybe again badmouth your name and things like this. So the fifth stage is maintenance and radical acceptance. This is the maintenance stage. So as mentioned, there's the notion of the theory of change model. So again, if let's say you just have an addiction, you could probably consider this as almost like an addiction, but obviously, anyway, it's your family of origin, so it's not obviously an addiction. But if you're in a narcissistic abuse cycle and your family's narcissistic, and the notion of the shared fantasy, you can also, I guess, at some level understand as an addictive sense. But again, there's the denial stage. That was when you were a child and you didn't know any better. This is the air you breathe. Then you started to have maybe some pre-contemplative, like start to see the cycle, but you still would excuse it or minimize it. But then you started to take action. And first is the planning, but then there's there's the notion of action. So you actually maybe limit contact, no contact, or you've started to research and done your own inner work to protect yourself and set boundaries. But then now there's the notion of the maintenance stage. So because you don't want to slide back down into this denial or into just in the sense of using again, right? Like again, you might think that it's not to say you should go no contact always, but it has to depend on your situation. But so you sustain no contact, you've survived the hoovering attempts, and you're no longer engaging. You're grieving, so you aren't just grieving the loss of the parents you had, you're grieving the parents you never had. And the dynamic is now fully an object. You can look at their behavior and predict it like weather forecast without being emotionally destroyed by it. The narcissistic move They will likely find a new scapegoat, a sibling, a partner, because they cannot hold their own shadow. Your work is to build a logical family, friend support system, therapy, and grounding yourself in your own reality. And but yeah, just to as a summary, healing is not a linear journey, but moving from being embedded in the trauma to viewing it objectively is the goal. Validation: if you are in the cognitive dissonance phase, be patient with yourself. It takes time to deprogram you from the cult-like family system. Yeah, so this is just understanding that, again, it's, at the beginning stages, it's part of your subject, and you're seeing probably a neurosis in yourself. Your insecurities are operating, and then you're over time starting to see it as more of an object in your awareness as the family system. And yeah, it's tricky because like you also probably could have went through therapists or professionals, and again, they maybe were treating you for anxiety or depression, or maybe you have some health challenges too you've had maybe. And what to say, if they again, because a lot of therapists, not, well, I shouldn't say a lot of them, but the ones that don't know about this dynamic would probably encourage communication and would probably see success as you having some form of relationship with this parent that you're estranged from. And of course, that's all well and good, and that's probably what you want. But then if they don't really pick up on some of these nuances of narcissistic abuse and the ways in which your parent actually is, then it could be actually more detrimental, because and maybe they even somewhat subtly shame you or put the onus on you to change, or to at least help the relationship. But this is just the understanding that you can't, reason with like a person that's not fully sane or has their reality testings off and is, semi-psychotic, right? And yeah, anyway, this is tricky. It's not easy, but in this video, I just wanted to talk about these 5 stages. Actually, this is my first live stream, and so I guess I have 36 viewers right now. And yeah, I'll probably do this. I'm going to try to do it consistently, like every Saturday or so. And I'll probably find better ways to interact with you guys and be a little more learning the system and that kind of thing. But yeah, I just wanted to be more educational. Maybe if you have any questions, I could briefly answer them. And I'm probably only going to go to about 1 o'clock. So if anybody wants to ask anything, again, it's not therapeutic advice. You obviously should go to an actual therapist, and this is just generalized situations. And I'll just speak more broadly. I can't really speak to your direct situation, but if you just wanted to talk about a certain topic or something you're thinking about, definitely it'd be nice to hear your feedback. So I'll just scroll up here and maybe see if there's any questions. But so yeah, Kayla, Stefan saying, very interesting work and the various sources you research. So thank you for that. This is Ross. He says, hello, watched my first posting of yours last night. I'm in Calgary. My name was son of a bitch. My dad would call my daughter his love legitimate grandchild, the little mutt. Yeah, it's easy to blame one vulnerable family member than the whole family. That's true. Yeah, and like what's Ross saying, sometimes just never, these people don't change, right? Yeah, lying is definitely an issue with family, like the lies. I think that sometimes the first time you pick up on it too is that you're noticing perhaps a sibling or people are lying, and it's just okay, why are they lying? And there's always this mistruth, or it's never this tangible loving family, right? So yeah, Ross also says, I didn't think it was my problem. I couldn't fathom their behavior and was baffled even as a child. Yeah, that's true. I think sometimes it's we always have this awareness to some degree, and yeah, some people deal with it differently, right? And maybe you rebel too. It's something to think about too. Yeah, so Alice Rose says, being isolated means you have no one to compare. Yeah, and then Kay Stefan is saying, baffling, absolutely, greed of power. And a lot of this has to do with sometimes greed, like power. It's there's a notion of like dominant hierarchies and like growth hierarchies. And so like in a growth hierarchy, parents want their child to do well and better than them and want them to be successful and are nurturing their skills. But then there's dominant hierarchies, right? And throughout history, right, that was mostly, somewhat, history probably was, right, domination. But yeah, just like it's like having a tyrant, right, in your family, and it's not really about your growth. And I think that's too what you start to notice as you separate yourself from the family more. Is like you realize that you're growing, and then they don't, because misery likes company, right? They try to pull you back into their orbit, and then they're not really changing, and they're just dominating. So just like it doesn't make sense. So I think it's about you honoring your growth hierarchy, and it's also maybe if you're a family of your own, nurturing your kids to help them grow. Yeah, so I guess Jane says, thanks. So glad to found your channel. Thank you. Emotionally mature. What a knee slapping howler. Well, yeah, a lot of people talk about emotionally maturity. Sam Vatkin was very much against saying that narcissistic, well, if someone's narcissistic, they're not just emotionally mature, right? But I would say that there are probably parents out there that, right, are more just emotionally mature, and it's just different lenses to look through. Yeah, I've seen Incognito, Narcissist Abuse Never Again. He's very adamant, I think, about it being genetics and about, it makes sense. So what else? Maybe here, Alice Rose is, why do they pit siblings against each other? Is it just divide and rule? I think that's part of it. Like, dividing is definitely what a narcissist does. I think there's also, the notion of these infantile defenses. And so splitting because their psyche is not fully formed, and they have to, like, they can't own their bad parts. So they project it onto the child, and also their good parts, like the golden child and the scapegoat, and there's like a lost child. And they pin them against each other too, I think, because I guess if they maybe they don't gang up, right? And so if like all the siblings were against the parent, then they wouldn't have as much power. And so, yeah, I guess it is somewhat divide and conquer, but within a family system. So I guess, yeah, Ross says, to be honest, as possible, I can't use the term mom because I assume a lot. I just regard her as the female who gave birth to me. That's the most honest. Yeah, that sometimes is helpful. Like I've had clients where they won't call them like my mom, and I've always had to be careful, right, that when I'm talking like with them and not using their word mom. But yeah, they might use the first name or like my abuser. So it's something to think about. It gives them less power in some sense, I would say. But yeah, Alice Rose said, my sister badmouthed me to my kids. Yeah, they really probably try to interfere with your family and just your own happiness usually. And there's also just the notion of a lack of differentiation. So it's like they want to emotionally fuse with you still, or they don't think that you're an independent person. And so, but that comes back to, yeah, lack of respect and lack of empathy. Yeah, Mana Peace says, hoovering is spider love. Spiders love flies. So Libby asks how best to handle flying monkeys, siblings in my case. Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I did a video on flying monkeys and siblings, and it's just the notion like they're, I guess, again, the extension of the parents. And so like with the Wizard of Oz, right, the Wicked Witch of the West sends her minions and her flying monkeys to get Dorothy and to kind of get her off her path. And so you can have these experiences where there's like different types of flying monkeys too, right? There's just the ones that are ignorant and are easily persuaded by the narcissist, likely. And then there's the ones that maybe have their own narcissistic qualities and they're part of this power, framework or this game. And so they might like the drama. And then, yeah, it's just like a cult system. And what to say? But how do you deal with them? I think I think when you realize that this is the way your parent is, and this is the way that the system's operating as like a cult, then you just start to become more suspicious of these. And then you pay attention, I think, to your intuition. And you kind of just, let's say you're speaking to one on the phone, and you kind of clue into the fact of why they're asking certain questions. And you probably know that they're going to spread this back to let's say it's your mother or your father. And so maybe you're just more keep it superficial, and obviously don't become emotionally reactive, but easier said than done. Yeah, there's a lot to be said about flying monkeys. Yeah, adult children who become abusers themselves. Yeah, it's interesting because I think in these families, right, maybe you have siblings. Like I had this one guy I was seeing, and he has an older brother, and he just obviously within these dysfunctional families, I've had some of my clients where, yeah, there's like one sibling that is really not well adjusted, and also may be, yeah, being groomed to be like the next narcissist. And it's this intermittent transmission that continues on the lineage. And if you're the scapegoat, in particular, if you have like no connection in some sense or no alliances within your family, it can be incredibly lonely, right? Because it's like, I think we all want to be connected to our lineage. In some sense, we always are, but there's this like, what to say, bad branch that we've come into this life, and we've been part of this, I guess, bad branch or this narcissistic, like we're raised by wolves in some sense, right? And then we were the scapegoat, and then we have to hold the shadow. But we step out of that process and we differentiate. And yeah, I think that's just what we have to do. But there's definitely this case that it's being like some of the siblings can be groomed to become narcissists themselves. So I'm just gonna keep scrolling down here. Yes, Lady Portland says 2 narcissist parents are an absolute doozy. I thought it would never get better when they got older, but no. Yeah, that's the thing. Narcissists, I think, on average, get worse as they age, right? And it's tricky too. Is obviously become sick, or they have a disease or something. Or they just need like support. They also, I guess, you probably want to be a caregiver maybe for them, but then that presents certain challenges too, because then maybe it's like obviously you're maybe starting your own family, or you have your own family, so it pulls you back into this cycle, right? And so how do you navigate that without it's either you go no contact, but then you have to probably deal with the guilt in some sense, because maybe, yeah, there's a part of you that says like, well, maybe I should have been there, but then if you do go into contact, it's like, how do you navigate that without getting pulled into the drama? So, and then Alice, yeah, says, and so good you address family narcissism. So many just do adult relationship issues, but family is tragically entrenched. Yeah. Yeah, stir up trouble before someone looks at my faults is common. It's definitely true. It's projection. Yeah, I've been getting some feedback about just that fact that, people are saying like, you really kind of understand this dynamic. And, it's interesting, right? That a lot of us can have at least similar experiences. And it's interesting. Yeah, it's a growing field, but more of awareness is coming to this. Originally, I like just a little bit of my journey. I mean, I started to read, well, I just mostly was Sam Vaktin's videos, I think. And I mean, I started to watch quite a few different videos, but for some reason, he just spoke to a lot of this. And yeah, that's kind of how I went down this rabbit hole. And yeah, what to say? I think it's good to have community and just people that have had similar experiences. And yeah, I've tried to like I attack it from different lenses, right, or like different approaches. And I think that at least just in my own personal life, right, I like to read different disciplines and different industries, right? I like to read some like business, or I like photography. I try to pay attention to business, like productivity, psychology, philosophy. I think within psychology, I also have there's just different, obviously modalities, and certain therapists will specialize. And I think it's good to specialize to some degree, but I think from this level of considering narcissistic abuse, there's just different lenses, right? And you can consider it from like a systems perspective. So like the family unit and like bone family therapy is usually what I pull from. There's also family constellations is another approach. And you can also understand it from narcissistic abuse. You can emotional immaturity. Uh, Narcissistic abuse, I tend to lean on like there's Sam Vatkin, there's Richard Grannon, but there's a host of different other videos. Like there's the book It's Not You is a good book. And what else? Yeah, cognitive behavior therapy can be an approach that can be helpful. Like you kind of understand like what's your trigger. Like, okay, my mom phones, I get upset, and my thoughts and feelings are like, I don't know, I'm no good, or why does my mom have to be like? So anyway, you have certain thoughts and feelings, and then you understand the behavior. So when I have those thoughts and feelings, this is my behavior. Like I don't want to go to work, or I kind of what to say, I don't know. Like you have certain behaviors, right? But you understand the thoughts and feelings, but you also understand the trigger, and then you do your best to reframe that trigger. And maybe it is just setting boundaries, but the notion is like reframing. So, and a lot of this you can also understand like script schema therapy, and just the notion of like inner parts, like so IFS therapy, this notion of like procedural logic. So I think that's some of this journey is just these being like these inner parts of the self, right? So that it just could be the case that like you have complex trauma, right? Like you have, let's say you're 8, you have a 10-year-old part, and then it's maybe with a therapist, or just if you you can't afford a therapist, or you just don't have the resources right now to do that, then you could read that book, No Bad Parts, and understanding some of these limited beliefs, because it's likely the case if you had complex trauma, you probably hold on, like maybe subconsciously or emotionally, to some of these beliefs. But yeah, it's examining that at the end of the day. It's like it's getting your family out of you, and it's the notion of also like these interjects. So in some sense, like your inner dialogue, you might still have, especially if it just went no contact. And some of this just takes time, I think, as you get this perspective. I think as you usually get experience and you just get away from this dynamic and you realize it isn't actually you. But when you're pulled into it, it is hard to heal, because you're just, I don't know, you're defending, explaining, arguing, and you're also maybe your neurosis or like your anxiety or your depression is getting worse, or maybe your body is reacting a certain way. So, but anyway, just learning about these limited beliefs, that they no longer serve you, and you don't need to hold on to them anymore, and these burdens. And so it's like unburdening these parts, but then like also integrating them. So that's just some of what I kind of do in terms of my approach. I think though for today, I'm just gonna I want to keep it to like 1 o'clock, and I've been going a little bit extra here, and I appreciate everyone commenting. I'll try to do this next Saturday, and hopefully you like this video. And this is my first stream ever, so it was good to do it, and I'm glad that people are responding to this. And so thanks everyone, and have a great weekend.